Alexander, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today. I found you, one of my students actually shared your article on risk aversion that was relating to like approaching women. And I started reading some of your articles and I was like blown away. Can you tell us a little bit about you, your background, how you got into studying mate selection and relationships, and also your academic background?
Sure. So previously, I was in a master's program for research in behavior and cognition in the personality branch. And in that, it does a lot of personality psychology, things related to relationships. And then more recently, finished a master's degree in behavioral and cognitive neuroscience. So a lot of different research skills. Now I'm in a PhD program studying couples and anxiety. So that's kind of my academic background there. And then aside from that, big research interests that I have are related to dating, attractiveness, romantic relationships, mate selection, short-term, long-term, all of those sorts of things. So part of what I've done is kind of begun the website and all of that, where I like to run surveys, do the statistical analysis, kind of test hypotheses maybe that haven't been tested in the research, and then just put that up on the website quick without trying to publish it in journals or anything, just so people can read it, make it a little bit more accessible for people.
I love it. Amazing. And I have a bunch of different articles here that you have written that I would love for you to just give us like your bird's eye view on them, because like every single article on your site, honestly, I had a hard time even just putting some on this list, because every single one I think is what our viewers and our students wonder about. And so I'm just going to kind of go down the line. If you could give me a bird's eye view of like what the research looked like and what your findings were, that would be amazing. So the first one is, the topic is, why is dating hard? Tell me about that study.
Sure. So the top dating difficulties. So we did this one first. What we did was we asked men and women on social media just to get an idea, like what are the top dating difficulties? So men and women are listing a bunch of different things, and then we would select those and we would create items for the survey based kind of on those responses and see like what people rate. And so certainly we find a lot of sex differences across the dating difficulties. Men and women tend to express very, very different dating difficulties. If I remember correctly, one of the top ones for women was finding someone that they have an intellectual connection with. That was, I think, the top issue that women said they had. So it was, women don't tend to have as much of a problem finding men that are interested. Women get a lot of interest and all of that, but finding a man that they like, who they have a connection with, that's a big one. And then for men, on the other hand, one of the top ones is going to be something like, I don't feel like I'm attractive enough. I don't get enough attention on dating apps, which certainly something we know from research on dating apps that, a lot of men just don't get matches on those. So the dating difficulties for men and women look very different. And another thing we looked at in that was locus of control. So locus of control is a personality construct that has to do with how much agency do you feel that you have? How much in control or perception of being in control of your own life do you have? So someone with an internal locus of control feels like they are in control of things. If they get good grades on a test, it's because they studied hard. If someone has an external locus of control, it's like they feel like things are out of their control. If they got a bad grade on a test, it's the teacher's fault, that kind of thing. And so we found that locus of control was robustly related to these dating difficulties across the board. People with a higher internal locus of control, they reported they had lower dating difficulty. External locus of control, they had more dating difficulty. So people, that feel like things are out of their control, they might also experience more difficulty dating.
Interesting. I love that. I hope my students feel like they have more control, because we give them steps on how to really master the dating process. So that's so interesting. Before, there's no manual for dating. So people are like, I have no control. I don't even know what I'm doing wrong or what I'm doing right. Women aren't going to tell you usually. They just stop communicating, right? So that's very interesting. And then, I love the title of this study. Are Chads more misogynistic? Tell me about your findings.
Sure. So this was a conceptual replication of a previous paper. So some background here. There's some, question as to what extent experiences with women make men more or less misogynistic, especially experiences with women in the dating market. One of these ideas is frustrated mating. The idea that, men who are not getting dates, who are frustrated in their mating experiences, who are not getting attention from women, they develop more negative attitudes toward women. And so that's something we've seen in some past research. But we also know that some traits associated with hostile attitudes toward women are associated with higher mating success as well. For example, like dark triad traits, for example, narcissism, Machiavellianism. Sometimes these men do a little bit better. They tend to have more sexual partners on average. So there's kind of a question there, like who is going to be more misogynistic? Is it men that have little dating experience, have trouble with women, or is it going to be men that have more experience? Now, the paper that we did a replication on, they looked at sociosexuality, And in that, there's a measure of like how many sexual partners have you had, and that sort of a thing. And then they had a measure that they used that they called the extreme misogyny scale. And this was a scale that they got items from the manifesto of Elliot Rodger, who was kind of an incel shooter. And they found, okay, men that had more partners had higher agreement with that. So we tried to replicate that, but we didn't replicate it. We found basically the opposite effect, that yeah, the men that had more agreement with these statements, they were much more likely to have been without sex in the last 2 years, to have never had sex, to identify as incels, that sort of a thing. We made another scale as well. We called it the Chad scale in this. And the Chad scale was kind of a measure of kind of a construct of like, what is a Chad as far as the discourse on that goes. So it's men that are very handsome. They have certain physical traits, you know, like more facially attractive, taller, more muscular, but then also men that are more successful with women. So we had questions like that as well in the scale. Essentially, did you do well with women, you know, when you were a teenager is kind of part of it. You know, have you had many sexual partners? Have you had lots of relationships that went well? That sort of a thing. Yeah, and we found, you know, the higher men scored on this, basically, so the more men saw themselves as successful and attractive and all of that, the much lower they were in this misogyny measure that came from the original paper. And I mean, this was a really, really big difference. These are really huge effect sizes. So it was a very, very large difference, actually. So there was a lot of support there for the frustrating mating hypothesis, or frustrated mating hypothesis. The idea that, yeah, the more successful men are with women, the better they feel about themselves as far as being attractive to women. Yeah, the less hostile attitudes they're going to have toward women.
Interesting. So for any ladies that are watching, if you come across a man who's super misogynistic, it sounds like probably he's just not doing very well with women. Interesting.
Yeah,
that probably makes the women feel better. Like, I'm sorry that you're not doing well. But anyway, okay. And then you did a study on what is a high body count. This I'm really curious about. So what is a high body count, and is it different for men and women?
Sure. So we've done a few of those, and we just did a really recent one on body count as well that we put up. So what is a high body count? We asked a bunch of questions. I'm trying to remember everything that we included in this. One of these was, you know, the extent to which people have an ideal body count. And what we found, you know, that the ideal body count in a partner for men or women is pretty low. You know, if you ask people like, what is the ideal? It's going to be, you know, 3, 4, 5 partners or something like that. And there's past research that has been done that found a very similar thing. Surprisingly, it's not 0, because, you know, there's a lot of discourse on, especially for men, like, do men prefer virgins? On average, men didn't say 0. 0 wasn't even the median response or the modal response. Most men seem to want, I don't know why, they seem to prefer a woman that has had a little bit of experience, and the same for women. You know, again, I don't know why. There perhaps is a little bit of a bias against people with no experience. Perhaps people feel like maybe they don't want to be that first person in a sense. But then we see, you know, as it goes on, it drops off. And then we kind of looked at like, when is it too many? When is it a deal breaker? And that's kind of when we begin to see a big difference for men and women. For men, it's about 20. When men say, okay, 20, it's getting pretty high. And for women, it was higher. It was about 40. So there we see kind of a big sex difference. Women are going to be a little bit more tolerant about what a high body count is. But consistent with past research, if you ask people what the ideal is for men and women, it's similar and it's very low. Then there's a big window of essentially tolerance, you know, where it's kind of like, okay, maybe that's not ideal to have a lot of partners, you know, up to 20 or something like that. But they're kind of handling it. We also asked men and women, did they ever end a relationship because of it? And we also asked men and women if they ever asked. So I think we found about 30 to 40% of men and women, they just don't even ask to begin with. So maybe they don't want to know, maybe they don't care that much, whatever the case may be, they're just not having that discussion. I think it was about 5% of men and women that during early dating stages, they ended a relationship. Well, I guess I say relationship, but it would be early dating. They ended the dating because the body count was too high. So it doesn't seem to be that common that people are ending relationships over it. People do have a preference that's kind of small, a larger window of tolerance. But yeah, generally men and women, they prefer it on the lower end as an ideal.
Interesting. So don't tell them if you're over 20 if you're a lady.
Don't
tell them if you're over 40. Stop bragging about your body count, dudes.
And maybe don't even ask, you know.
That's a good rule to follow. So then you have another study on how attractive are red pill influencers. Tell me about that.
Sure. So this is a very recent one that we did here because we have these red pill influencers, right? All men. We have different names, famous people within kind of the red pill sphere. And I said, okay, we made a survey. I presented a video clip from some of their most recent videos, and I had men and women both rate their physical attractiveness and their vocal attractiveness as well. So initially, what we saw, physical attractiveness and vocal attractiveness very highly correlated. I think it was like 0.7 or 0.8, so very, very large correlation. So yeah, there's past research that indicates physical attractiveness, facial attractiveness, and vocal attractiveness is correlated. And so there's probably an effect there that, if you like the way someone looks, you're going to think their voice is more attractive. If you like someone's voice, that. But they're also correlated independently. So if you blind the face and the voice, you separate them so people don't see them in conjunction, you still see a correlation. So more attractive people actually have more attractive voices, even independently of kind of the halo effect. But we didn't separate them. We just looked at it concurrently. And yeah, we saw, consistent with past research, a very strong correlation, 0.7 to 0.8. And then going down the list, yeah, we have just kind of descriptive statistics for the attractiveness of all of these influencers. Typically, women rate them lower on average, which is something that we see very consistently across the research, that women will rate pictures, at least, of men lower than men will. So that's what we see. But yeah, most of them got rated pretty low for physical and vocal attractiveness. Averages on a scale of 7 between like 2, 3 or something like that. So that's kind of the interesting thing that's going on there. We have kind of the red pill discourse, which is like, you can be successful with women through game and other things like that, intersexual dynamics. And then the other thing kind of closely related to incels is like the black pill, which is kind of like physical attractiveness is the only thing that matters. So kind of looking at these, we have a lot of red pill influencers who claim that they've been very, very successful with women. But if we ask men and women to rate them, they get very, very low ratings. So it's kind of like, are their claims real? If they are, maybe that doesn't matter that much, and other things do matter more. So there's kind of different things to get from that. One important thing, we also looked at feminist identification. We looked at how positively people viewed the red pill and how familiar they were with these influencers, because that could bias the ratings as well. If people hate them, if they, or they know who they are, or whatever the case may be, that can shift the ratings. But there was only a very small relationship between the variables in that. So most of the ratings can't be explained by that, maybe only about 10% of the variance. So yeah, independent of what people think of these people, they tend to rate them pretty low. So that's kind of the landscape of the red pill sphere. It's mostly not men that people see as conventionally attractive.
Interesting. Okay. Tell me about unattainable female beauty standards in that study.
Sure. So for this, first we kind of polled men and women with like open questions, like what are some beauty enhancement things? And then we turned them into survey items. And for this, we asked men and women basically to just indicate like, how much more attractive would this make a woman? So it's women saying how much more attractive this would make a woman. And it's also men saying how much more attractive would this make a woman? And we have a lot of things on there that are kind of like painting your nails, dyeing your hair blonde, getting liposuction or lip filler or septum piercing, for example, is one. And we see, basically the things that men and women tend to think are going to be the most effective at enhancing beauty are very basic conventional beauty standards that are going to be like shaving your armpits, body hair removal, that kind of a thing, as opposed to more extreme procedures like getting lip filler or, unconventional piercings like the septum piercing. Those are things that tend to get rated very, very low. So kind of the takeaway from that is probably that, when we talk about conventional beauty standards, especially if they're unattainable or something like that, the things that seem to matter the most are kind of the very basic, almost basic grooming type behaviors. And a lot of the more extreme body modifications, cosmetic surgery, they might appeal to kind of like a niche or something like that, but they don't seem to be something that really enhances beauty kind of across the board. So maybe there's a couple of takeaways from that, is that anyone that's trying to kind of enhance their beauty in a general way or something, they're probably good, following just like conventional beauty norms, and they probably don't have to worry about extreme plastic surgery or anything like that. Weight loss was up there though. So yeah, not being overweight is a big one also, kind of perhaps contrary to a lot of body positivity and things like that. Yeah, people still tend to prefer normal weight bodies, I guess.
That makes sense. That's very interesting. And speaking to attractiveness, you did a study on the neuroscience of facial attractiveness. Tell me about that.
Sure. So this was a monograph that I wrote that I eventually just decided to put up on there. Yeah, it covers a lot of the research on the neuroscience of facial attractiveness. I think probably some important takeaways from that, without getting into a lot of details on the ERPs and fMRI locations and that sort of thing, is we have this halo effect identified by a psychologist in the 70s and really, really well replicated, that if we see something that's beautiful, we tend to think that it's good. So if we see attractive people, we assign good personality traits to them and good behaviors. We think that they're going to be a better person. But also, if we see people behaving in a pro-social way, if we see people acting good, we also tend to rate them as more physically attractive. And so what we see across all of this neuroscience research on facial attractiveness is that the areas associated with facial attractiveness and the kinds of ERP responses are also associated with perceptions of moral goodness and with other forms of aesthetics. So we see that in the brain as well, that this halo effect is bidirectional and that it's activating the similar parts of the brain. Some other interesting things there. Yeah, men tend to respond to facial attractiveness a little bit more strongly than women do. Something there, there's as well, people discuss a lot, to what extent is attractiveness subjective, can it be measured and all of that. I mean, you get facial attractiveness ratings, people are rating these faces as more attractive. So then you have these ratings, these, average ratings. You show those faces to people and the more attractive faces in all of these people will light up brain regions more. So yeah, we've evolved in such a way as to recognize attractive faces and unattractive faces and distinguish between the two. And we see a lot of different responses based on those. So to some extent, there's individual variation in what we find is attractive, but there's also some shared perceptions of attractiveness there. And we can see that kind of in the brain.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I wonder how that influences, have you done any research on how that influences like social media, the way that people engage with social media? I'm assuming the more attractive you are, the more followers you're going to have and all of that.
There is a whole subfield in psychology that is all about the attractiveness of sales and influencers on social media. I get notifications for different papers every day, and every single day I get like 5 or 6. There's just an enormous amount of research into this. I don't always read all of those, but one thing that stands out for social media, there's an effect right now on social media where it might be harming people's mental health to some extent. And one of the mechanisms for that might be through social comparisons, what are called upward social comparisons. So people go online, they see beautiful people everywhere who, are probably in the top 1% of attractiveness or something like that. But you're seeing so many of these people, you think it's kind of normative. You're seeing that they have a great life and all of these edited pictures. You're comparing yourself to them. And those upward social comparisons make people feel bad. So that's perhaps one effect that we see, in the psychological literature of social media on people that is related directly to attractiveness, is that being bombarded with attractive people all the time, it can make people kind of feel bad and they think like, well, I'm not that attractive. My body doesn't look like that or whatever. Just, constant exposure.
Yeah. So interesting too with AI coming out and how people manipulate their appearance. And, that's really interesting. I honestly, I wish that I had your life and I could just study all this stuff all day long. It's so interesting. Okay. So risk aversion in dating. This is the article that my student shared with my community. And I just thought it was so fascinating. Tell me more about that and how it relates to approaching women for men.
Sure. So risk aversion in dating, we asked men and women, we asked men particularly, have you approached a woman for a date within the last year? And this isn't just approaching a stranger for a date. We gave a bunch of different situations where someone could ask, have you approached a friend for a date, like at school or at work or a hobby? Have you approached, a stranger on the street, that kind of a thing? Have you approached in any other situation? So it's any kind of asking a woman for a date. And we found, that more than half of men had not approached a woman, had not asked a woman on a date. Single men had not asked a woman on a date within the last year. So there's a lot of single men. They want a date. They said that they were looking to date, as a matter of fact. We asked that as one of kind of the initial questions, but they're not asking women on dates. So we looked at a measure of risk aversion, which is basically what it sounds like as well. How tolerant are people to risk and how averse are people to risk? Some people are able to do things that are scary and that might have consequences or perceived consequences, and they're just like, fine, I'll take the risk. Other people can't. Other people are like, no, I can't. And then we see a relationship there between risk aversion. Yeah, men that are higher in risk aversion, they're much less likely to have asked a woman on a date. We also asked about incel identification. So, the involuntary celibate community, they also scored higher on this risk aversion. And we asked men why. There were different reasons why. Why would you not ask a woman on a date? What are you afraid of, basically? And, so there's a fear of social consequences. I think fear of rejection was the highest. Fear of social consequences was the second. Fear of legal consequences was on there, but it was down a little bit more. So, we asked that one because, there's some discourse. People are like, oh, I might get kicked out of school if I ask a woman on a date, Me Too or something like that. It's not that common that happens, but if there is a perception that can drive it, but still, fear of rejection and fear of social consequences, those were the two really big ones. So it doesn't seem like most people are like, oh, I would, except, I'm afraid I'm going to get kicked out of school. I think it's just scary to ask women on dates and to approach strange women. You have a classmate that you get along with and you like, and you're like, oh, what if she's going to hate me? What if she's going to say something mean? This is just a universal experience for men. It's not new. And men have always been terrified to ask, women on dates. Probably the bravest man still feels that. He just does it anyway. And that's what risk aversion is you feel the fear, but you take the risk anyway, where some people feel the fear and they don't. We also asked women, important in this, if they would like to be approached more. And a very large percentage of women said that they did, especially young women. It was something about 70 or 80% of women between 18 and 30 said, yeah, I wish more men would ask me on dates in person. So, it could be that a lot of women like that dynamic, that more traditional dynamic, like, we're in real life, a man comes, he says, hey, would you like to go on a date, as opposed to maybe just dating apps or whatever the case may be.
Wow. And did you do any research, or do you know why some people have a bigger risk aversion and some people have less?
I don't know. It's difficult to know for things like that. So certainly within personality psychology, there's the 50-0-50 rule, or in behavioral genetics, I should say, which is, about 50% of personality, whatever the trait may be, and of course this varies by traits, is heritable. So some people are just more like that, they're born that way, and but then there's environmental causes, experiences that people have had. Those can drive it as well. If someone grew up and, they've just been rejected all the time, or they've experienced serious consequences for taking risks or something like that, then they're more likely, perhaps to avoid risk in the future. There's personality traits like neuroticism in the big five, the big personality thing that's going to be related to risk aversion. People that are more emotional, more high strung are going to be like that. And we also know, that people that are much more willing to take risks are people that have higher antisocial and dark personality traits. Again, the dark triad. Who scores really, really low in something like risk aversion? I mean, people in jail. People that are willing to take big risks. So it's all over the place. Like who's going to have higher and lower risk aversion? There's all kinds of different things that can determine it.
Wow, so interesting. It really, really fascinating. Okay, this one I thought was so interesting. In fact, I had to read through this whole thing, and I would love you to give me the snippet of it. But who initiates more divorces and why?
Sure. So this was not one that we ran, but it was a review of kind of all of the literature. And yeah, and a lot of, red pill manosphere discourse, there's a lot of women initiate X% of divorces, saying 70% of divorces, 80%, 110%, whatever. So they're always saying women initiate most divorces, which seems to be true. That women do seem to initiate these divorces more on average. And the way that tends to be measured in the research is by asking divorced couples, who asked for the divorce first, or who initiated it, that sort of thing, who wanted it more. So what we see, is that it usually is the case that women are the first ones to bring it up more than men, about 60 to 70% of the time. Women are more likely to be the first one to say, yeah, I'd like a divorce. But if you get into it a little bit deeper, you ask men and women, did you both want the divorce? They'll both say yes. You see high agreement there. So it's usually not the case that women want a divorce and men don't. Usually when it gets to that point, regardless of who is initiating it or who is asking first, I think both people kind of know the relationship is in trouble, it's not going well. Yeah, they're both kind of on board there. And then another thing, in all of the literature, people say women initiate these divorces more, and I think that's where they stop. And so they think, women initiated it, so it's their fault. They've done something wrong. But people don't get divorced for no reason at all,
The first thing that comes to my mind is women initiate more. Maybe this is just an assumption, not tested in research, but maybe because men are more unfaithful. So
well, and
my initial thought was that it was their fault. Yeah, interesting.
Well, you're correct, and that's one of the very large sex differences that we see across evolutionary psychology, is that men are much more likely to cheat. This is something that replicates over and over and over again. And, that's one of the reasons, that makes kind of the top 10 lists for divorce. Why did you get divorced? Infidelity. Because he cheated, basically. And so when you look at reasons like that, men are more likely to use drugs as well. And that's another thing that tends to make these top 10 lists for divorces. Men are more likely to engage in antisocial behavior, drug use, infidelity, that kind of a thing. So that can explain a lot of the gap there as far as who initiates most divorces. Still, the top reason for initiating divorces is just we grew apart. And when you ask men and women why, they both really agree on that. We grew apart. And it's probably the case, that women are more willing to initiate it when it gets to that. Because we know that relationship satisfaction declines a little bit faster and a little bit easier for women as well. So in a bad relationship, men are probably more likely to just stick it out and just be whatever. And men are more likely to cheat, right? As well. That's another thing too. A relationship can be bad. Men will not necessarily end the relationship. They'll do what's sometimes called quiet quitting the relationship, or they'll have an affair or something. Women are more likely to be I want to get out, and they're ready to leave in that sense.
So interesting. That was bringing up some things that I have studied, which is the age of when you get married really matters. The likelihood of divorce if you get married older goes down. And I would assume that's, growing apart. If I got married when I was 25, for example, I think there would be so much of a chance of growing apart because it's, you just grow and change so much from 25 to say 40, but from 40 on, I don't know. It's really interesting, just the data. So
Absolutely, yeah. I hear that a lot, especially from women, is like, I've changed so much from when I was 20 to like 30, 35 or something like that. And people really seem to, personality is very stable across the lifespan, but I think a little bit later in life, it stabilizes even more. Yeah, and it seems like by mid 30s, people are, they're much more calm. They're much less willing to take risks and behave impulsively. That's a big thing that we do see actually that shifts in personalities. Kind of impulsive behavior. Yeah. By the mid 30s, even early 30s, people have calmed down a lot and probably they're better decision makers, changed a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, so interesting. I met my partner when I was in my 20s, but we didn't marry until recently, and we're both like late 30s, 40s. And we did stay together, but there was a lot of changing. And then you just got to hope that you grow together. And there's times when it was like, I don't know, you coming with me? You know what I mean? So interesting. Okay, then you have a study about the normie gets the girl. I have ideas about what the normie means in groups that I'm in, but tell me what that meant for that study.
Sure. So for this study, we used vignettes and we described different scenarios. So there are these two constructs from this inventory called the ambivalent sexism inventory. And one is called hostile sexism and one is called benevolent sexism. Hostile sexism is kind of what I think most people would think of as sexism, like someone who simply hates women, like flat out, they have hostile attitudes toward women. Benevolent sexism is what some feminists conceptualize as sexism, but I think what a lot of people would call like chivalry. So it's, for example, an item on that inventory is like women should be first on the lifeboat, or you should hold doors for women. So these are things, that some people would probably not consider sexist and might consider good things. That's why it's called benevolent sexism. So the two vignettes took these items and basically described a person who was hostile sexist, benevolent sexist. We took another vignette and we described someone who's kind of a traditionalist in that sense, someone who was perhaps less traditional, and then kind of a normie, someone who's just like totally disengaged, just kind of describing it. And then also kind of a manosphere vignette. So it was someone that had a lot of these manosphere beliefs. And what we found, was the vignettes that got rated the lowest for men and women were the hostile sexist and the manosphere vignette. And so again, this is kind of consistent with the Chad misogyny thing as well, that, you have a man who's describing things like, oh, I'm so mad at women, women are just going to take advantage of me. Women should not be allowed to do this and that. Those are the ones that women rate really low is being attractive. It doesn't matter if it's for like short-term mating, long-term mating or anything. We also asked women in that, like, do these give you the ick? So we just asked yes or no, like an ick thing. That's kind of what we want to look into more in the future, is like, what is this ick phenomenon? But yeah, we found the same, very similar things. Like the manosphere vignette in particular, a lot of women said, no, this guy that's regurgitating these manosphere memes just doesn't, no.
Interesting. I'm going to skip one of them just because I'm really curious about what the top deal breakers are on dating apps.
Sure. So I don't know if I'm going to remember them all off the top of my head, but some of the top deal breakers on dating apps, I guess the interesting ones to look at would be where we see sex differences for men and women. So one that's kind of close to the top for men and women both is having a child. So we know that that's something that makes dating very difficult for people. And for men, it was a little bit more serious. It was a little bit closer to the top of the list. So men are a little bit less willing to date someone who is a single parent in that sense. There were some other interesting ones on there that kind of came up, kind of like I mentioned from the other one. We had looked at things in the beauty standards like septum piercing, which got rated really, really low in the beauty standards, septum piercings being the nose piercing. And we found that for men, that was also a pretty high, actually, a dating deal breaker. So about 20% of men said that they would just immediately swipe left. And then you have about 60 or 70% of men that give it a rating that say, yeah, that's really not good. So there's different things like that for women and men both, women a little bit more, having differences in like political attitudes or something like that. So that's kind of another thing I think that we see, just kind of anecdotally on dating apps is, you will have women that perhaps ask, like, I want someone who's politically compatible. And it's interesting because there's some recent research that indicates for younger individuals, women might be becoming a little bit more liberal and men might be becoming a little bit more that youngest demographic. And we also see that this is a demographic that's struggling a lot with dating. So knowing that like that kind of political compatibility is important could explain up some of that, but kind of a digression there. I'm trying to think, what other sorts of things are deal breakers on the app? Probably some classic ones I think that most people know is like, posing with a gun or something like that. typically the hunting profiles where people have a fish or something like that. People don't tend to like those as much. There's some about shirtless pictures because there's some debate about to what extent the shirtless pictures are they bad. You'll see some people say they're really bad. So that actually got rated really low. Most people don't actually, most women I should say, don't find that actually to be a deal breaker. And I think there's some more empirical research on dating apps that said actually men that had shirtless pictures who, you know, were physically fit, which, you know, if you're posting a shirtless picture, they tend to be, actually did pretty well. So perhaps that's kind of contrary to some of the folk wisdom on what works on dating apps is like sometimes, yeah, shirtless gym selfie seems to do it. But there's so many on those lists. I'm not going to remember all of them off the top of my head.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I have a couple of things that I teach my students that I'm curious if you researched or if your research correlates with that. One is eye contact. Eye contact, in my opinion, is so important on a dating app. And there's actually was a study that was done, but then it was later debunked. I forget who it was. I want to say it was OkCupid, where they said, if you look away into the distance, you're going to be more attractive to women. But then, what was it? Photo Feeler came out with another study that said that it's complete garbage. And really, you should be making eye contact with the camera. So I don't know if you did any research on that or smiling, but those two things are like my number ones for my students. You got to be looking at the camera unless you're doing something in the photo where we know as the audience what you're doing, and then you've got to be smiling. Did you any research on that?
I haven't done any personally, but there is past research that indicates smiling photos are more attractive for men and women both. So smiling is probably good, assuming that you have a good smile to begin with. Maybe you don't want to smile, but the eye thing is interesting. I don't know if there's any research on the extent to which eye contact makes photos perceived as more attractive, but there's a lot of research in the field of attention on eyes. And something we know is that eyes cue attention. So if someone is looking left, you also look left. If something's looking forward, then eyes engage attention. So making eye contact will make people engage with you as well. And it will make people spend more time. If you do like eye tracking studies, you look at the time spent looking at the face. So I could see how something like that would be related, yeah, to attractiveness. Because if it's engaging your attention, especially even for like swipes or something like that,
yeah,
you know, because you're only looking, you know, a lot of the time at a photo for a minute and deciding what to do. The longer it holds your attention on that photo, the more you're going to think about it. And probably, you know, if you're spending more time on it, maybe you're not going to reject it as quickly.
Yeah, I would assume so. And I think even in real life, eye contact is so attractive. Eye contact with a smile. You walk down the street and talk to, or not even talk to strangers, but you just walk by strangers, make eye contact with each one and smile. People will turn their head and look at you. It's like, what is this? Especially if you live in a big city, because there's more, I forget what it's explained. Like there's more, people don't look at each other, right? In a big city versus in the suburbs.
I have noticed with smile, because I have kind of just a resting face. It's kind of like a resting angry face, and I'll notice, you know, when I'm grocery shopping or something like that, I won't be smiling, and then the minute that I smile at the cashier or anyone, it just changes the whole way that they interact. Then they smile back, and it's like, oh, he's nice.
Yeah, very disarming. So interesting. Okay, and last but not least, this one I also had to dig into because I was like, oh, so interesting. Why college grads are less likely to be single or divorced? Tell me about that.
Sure. So these are some statistics that I took from a nationally representative data set. I forget which one it was, but it's on there. And yeah, split by sex, and we're looking who is more likely to be divorced, who's more likely to be single or widowed. And what do we see? Basically that there's a linear relationship with education and being married, not being divorced, and not being single. So in other words, who's most likely to get divorced? People with no education at all. Who's a little bit less likely to get divorced? Someone with a high school education. Who's less likely than them? Bachelor's degree. Even less likely, master's degree, and PhD holders, men and women both, the least likely to get divorced. So there's some discourse out there, like, again, in the manosphere, you see it, that you have men kind of recommending, like, don't date a woman with a career who's educated because she's going to be learning things in university. She's, you know, more likely to divorce you or something like that. So what's interesting is women that have higher levels of education, they are slightly more likely to initiate a divorce, but they're much less likely to get divorced in the first place, which I think is kind of ties into the other thing. It's like if they're more likely to initiate, but they're way less likely to get divorced, there's probably something about partner selection there. So, you know, we know that individuals higher in intelligence score higher in IQ, also much likely or much less likely to get divorced. So really, you know, at the end of the day, for marriage and not getting divorced, what would be a good position to be in? Be someone who's highly educated yourself and pick a partner who's highly educated. And there's probably an effect here where, you know, education functions as a screening for personality. Who is most likely to get high levels of education. So people who are a little bit more agreeable, which we know is very protective in relationship, agreeableness on the big five, and individuals who are more conscientious. So they're kind of paying attention to the rules, the other people, they're doing kind of what they're supposed to do, and individuals who are a little bit lower in neuroticism, which is kind of emotional instability. So yeah, high education is kind of a filter for that. You know, there's probably a lot going on there. Better income, which we know is associated with lower divorce as well. But yeah, at the end of the day, you know, having that's what it comes down to. Yeah, high education, better for marriage prospects for men and women both.
That is so surprising to me because you probably know this better than anybody. The amount of time that you have to dedicate in your studies for a PhD. I don't know if you're in a relationship or not, but I can imagine being with a partner during that time. You wouldn't have a lot of time for the partner. So I think it's really fascinating that that is one of the outcomes. And I wonder how many people get in relationships after they've done that versus like going through the process. I mean, it's such a long process of study that I would assume a lot of people have partners during that time. But do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, yeah, it's definitely a balancing act because, you know, you have to make, and I think, you know, in a relationship, you have to deliberately make time for your partner. You have to kind of force those other things to be like, okay, this is going to be on hold. I'm going to, you know, make time for her at this point. Because if you ignore someone, you know, even if you're busy with other things, kind of a bad signal down the line. But I think what happens a lot of the time, particularly in, you know, graduate school, PhD programs, is people very often pick partners who are in that environment. You know, so it's not uncommon that it's going to be another grad student or, you know, even sometimes teacher-student relationships, because at that point they're adults. It's not always prohibited. So sometimes you see that in academia, you know, that you'll have an advisor with their grad student or something, and, you know, they're all like 30 years old or whatever, but it's still kind of a interesting situation. So yeah, you know, often you have people in the same environment. And I think if they're in the same environment, they have more in common. Maybe even if they're really busy, at least they're kind of seeing each other around. But yeah, it's really important, you know, with work or anything like that, no matter how motivated and driven you are, that you do set some things aside and focus on the relationship, because you have to prioritize it. If you don't, you know, it's in danger.
Yeah. Did that study have any, or any studies that you've done look at level of education, and do people usually choose partners with the same level of education, or is it common for someone to go pursue their PhD and then their partner's a bachelor's, and does that have any impact on like maybe divorce? Or I'm just curious if you know.
Yeah, absolutely. People do tend to select partners with a similar level of education. And this is kind of a broad rule for partner selection across the board called assortative mating, that we tend to select partners who are similar to us. So we do that for socioeconomic status, people, you know, from a similar socioeconomic background. We do it for education level very, very strongly. We do it for physical attractiveness, assortative mating for personality traits, even assortative mating for negative personality traits. So yeah, when it comes to education, that's what we see, is that people tend to pick partners who have a similar level of education. Someone, you know, with a PhD or a master's degree, they're much more likely, yeah, to date someone who has like a bachelor's degree or a master's degree somewhere in there than they are to date someone with no level of education at all. I don't know the extent to which the combinations of all of those is going to predict a specific percentage of divorce. But if we know, for example, you know, that higher education is associated with lower divorce, then yeah, I'm sure, you know, you have someone with a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, you have a good pairing there. They're going to be less likely to get divorced.
So interesting. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this. I feel like it's so interesting and so cool that you're studying this and you're sharing it with everybody, and it's not locked behind a vault. You know, usually in academia, you can't really see everything. So this is like the coolest thing ever. How can our audience find you if they want to learn more about you or read some of these great studies that you've done, or just keep in touch with you?
Sure. So yeah, the website is datepsychology.com. And yeah, that's what I was trying to do, was put things up there so they're not locked behind a vault. On Twitter or X now they call it, Date Psych. I'm really active on there. And then the YouTube is alex.datepsych. So that's where to find me online and to read all the things.
Perfect. I'm going to link everything below this video so you can make it super easy to find you. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I am like so excited about the work that you're doing, and I'm excited to follow your career and see what you get into next.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I had a really good time.
Absolutely, Alex. Awesome. Cool.